The alarm cut through the mess hall before I even set down my tray. A long red pulse that meant only one thing on Threshold Station. An unscheduled ship had dropped out of slip space inside our perimeter, and it was already too close to stop. I was still holding a spoon when Mira grabbed my sleeve. She was 7, small for her age, with a scar along her wrist that never quite faded, and she knew that sound better than any adult on the station, because she had heard it once before, on the night her parents died. "It's them," she whispered. "It's them, isn't it?" I did not lie to her. I never lied to her. "Maybe," I said. "Stay close to me." The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and 3 Kael'thi walked in like they owned the deck plating under their feet. They were tall, silver-skinned, built like statues someone had decided to bring to life, and the one in front wore robes the color of dry ash. I had seen him once before, months ago, on a recorded briefing that Commander Dree had shown the senior staff. His name was difficult to say in any human throat, so in my head, I just called him Ash. The mess hall went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone in it understands they are watching something they will never forget. Commander Dree came through the side doors a moment later, moving fast for a Vorlothi, all 4 of his arms tense at his sides. He had a translator disc clipped to his collar, though he barely needed it after 3 decades working alongside humans. "Envoy," he said, "this is early. Your arrival window was scheduled for next cycle." "Plans change," Ash said. His voice, even through the translator, had a flatness to it that made my skin prickle. "We are here for the child. The debt is old. The claim is settled. We will not delay further." Every human in that hall turned to look at Mira, and Mira did the only thing a 7-year-old girl could do in that moment. She pressed herself against my leg and did not make a sound. I did not decide to stand up. My body simply did it, before my mind caught up, chair scraping back hard enough that the whole room flinched. "She's not going anywhere today," I said. Ash turned those stone-colored eyes on me, slow, deliberate, the way you look at a tool you did not expect to see moving on its own. "You are the maintenance worker," he said. "Daniel Hargrove, hydroponics and life support." I had not known he knew my name, and hearing it in his mouth made the moment feel even more dangerous than it already was. "That's right," I said, "and I'm also the person who's been raising her for the last 11 months, ever since I pulled her out of the wreck myself." Commander Dree's eyes flicked toward me, and I caught the warning in them, the silent plea to stop talking before I said something that could not be taken back. I ignored it. "Under compact law," I said, "a guardianship claim can be challenged if the primary caregiver has held that role for a full standard year. It's been 11 months. That's close enough that a hearing has to be granted before any transfer happens. I'm invoking that right now, in front of witnesses." The mess hall held its breath. I could feel Mira's small fingers digging into the fabric of my sleeve. Ash studied me for a long moment. Long enough that I started to wonder if I had misread the treaty entirely, if I had just humiliated myself and endangered every soul on this station over a technicality I only half understood. Then he inclined his head, barely, the motion so small I almost missed it. 23 days, he said. Then a hearing will be convened, and the matter will be settled according to law. Use the time as you see fit, human. It will not be enough." The Kael'thi turned and left as quietly as they had arrived, and the moment the doors closed behind them, the entire mess hall exhaled at once. Commander Dree crossed the room in 3 long strides and put one heavy hand on my shoulder. "Careful, the way you touch something fragile." "Daniel," he said quietly, "do you understand what you just did?" "I bought us 3 weeks," I said. "You bought yourself a legal battle against a species that has never lost one," he said. 23 days is nothing to them. It is everything to you." He was right, and I knew it even as the adrenaline was still burning through my chest. But I looked down at Mira, who had finally loosened her grip on my sleeve just enough to look up at me with something that had not been in her eyes in 11 months. Hope, thin and fragile, but real. I was not going to let that go for anything. The next morning I went straight to the station archive, a cramped room 3 decks down that most people forgot existed, and I asked the archive assistant, a patient woman named Grace Whitfield, to pull every document that mentioned the words guardianship and debt event. "You're really doing this," she said, not quite a question. I have to, I said. I don't have a choice anymore. I made a promise in front of witnesses. Grace worked in that archive longer than anyone else on the station, and she had a habit of reading treaty law the way other people read novels, purely for the pleasure of understanding something complicated. She pulled up file after file, translated compact text glowing on the screen between us, and together, we began building the only weapon I had, knowledge. The first thing we learned was that the 23 days were not a courtesy. They were a countdown built into the law itself, designed so that any human challenger would run out of time before they could properly prepare. The Kelthi did not cheat. They did not need to. Their system was built so that losing looked inevitable from the outside. There has to be something, I said, scrolling through page after page of dense legal language. Some precedent, some case where a human actually won a guardianship hearing. Grace went quiet for a long moment, then pulled up a file buried 3 folders deep, dated almost 20 years earlier. There's one, she said, a colonist on Varan Station. A man named Ethan Calder. He fought a debt claim over a mining contract, not a child, but the ruling set a standard. The court accepted testimony from station witnesses about the caregiver's conduct, not just written law. Character mattered, community mattered. It was thin, it was not much. But it was something, and something was more than I had walked in with. Over the next several days, word of what I had done spread through Threshold Station faster than any official announcement could have managed. Some people thought I was a fool who had put 90,000 lives at risk over one child. Others started showing up at my hydroponics bay in the evenings, offering to help however they could. A dock worker named Liam Ashby, who had lost his own daughter to a shuttle accident years before arriving on Threshold, spent 3 nights helping me organize testimony from crew members who had watched me raise Mira. A young engineer named Emma Doyle, barely older than a student herself, rewired an old recording drone so we could capture clean statements instead of relying on shaky handheld video. Mira herself began, slowly, to talk again. Not about the crash, not yet, but about small things. The color she wanted to paint her side of our shared quarters. The name she wanted to give the small hydroponics plant I had let her grow herself. A stubborn little tomato vine that refused to die no matter how many times she forgot to water it. I named her Hope, Mira told me one evening, pointing at the plant, because she keeps growing even when I mess up. I did not tell her how close that name felt to describing the two of us. On the 9th day, trouble arrived in a different shape entirely. A second Kelthi ship dropped into the system, smaller than the first, carrying not envoys but a legal observer named Threll Van, sent by a rival household with its own claim on the resolution of the case. Commander Dree called an emergency briefing the moment the ship docked. This complicates things, he said, pacing in front of the small gathered group of us who had been working the case. Threll Van does not care whether Daniel wins or loses. He is here to see whether the precedent damages his own household's future claims. If he believes a human victory here will cost his people leverage elsewhere, he will do everything in his power to make sure that victory never happens. Meaning what? Liam asked. He sabotages the hearing? Meaning he will look for any flaw in our procedure, Dree said. Any technical error, any missed filing. He does not need to defeat Daniel's argument. He only needs to find one crack in how it was presented. That night, I barely slept. I sat at the small desk in our quarters, going over every page Grace and I had assembled, checking and rechecking dates, names, filing formats, terrified that some tiny mistake would undo 3 weeks of work in an instant. Mira woke once, near midnight, and found me still at the desk. You should sleep, she said, in the oddly serious way she sometimes had, like a much older person wearing a child's voice. I will, I said, soon. She climbed onto the chair beside me, tucked her knees up to her chest, and watched me work for a while without saying anything else. It was the first time in 11 months she had chosen to stay awake with me, instead of retreating quietly to her own side of the room, and something about that small act of trust steadied my hands more than any legal precedent could have. On the 14th day, Threll Van made his first move. He filed a formal objection, claiming that my time as Mira's caregiver could not be counted from the day of the crash, since for the first several weeks, She had technically been under the medical custody of the station's emergency response team, not mine personally. If the objection held, my 11 months would shrink to barely 9, and the hearing itself would be thrown out before it began. Grace and I spent 2 full days combing through medical logs, shift records, anything that could prove continuity of care. It was Emma, of all people, who found the answer, buried in an overlooked visitor log from the medical bay. "Look at this," she said, turning her screen toward us. "Every single shift during those first weeks, there's a visitor entry. Same name, same timestamp pattern, morning and night." It was my name. I had not even remembered doing it consciously, but during those first terrifying weeks after the crash, while Mira lay recovering in the medical bay, unable to speak, unable to sleep without waking in fear, I had gone to sit with her every morning before my shift, and every evening after it ended. The logs proved it in a way no memory could argue with. We submitted the visitor records as a formal counter to Threll Van's objection, and 2 days later, the station's legal liaison confirmed that the objection had been dismissed. The clock kept counting down, but for the first time, I let myself believe we might actually survive it. The 19th day brought the second attack, and this one felt far more dangerous than the first. Threll Van requested a private interview with Mira herself, arguing that under compact law, the child's own preference, however informally expressed, could be entered as evidence. Commander Dree fought the request for an entire day, arguing that a 7-year-old should not be placed in a room alone with an alien legal observer she had never met, especially one whose interests were openly opposed to her own well-being. In the end, a compromise was reached. The interview would happen, but I would be allowed to remain in the room, silent, unable to speak on her behalf, but present. I have never been more frightened in my life than I was walking into that small gray room beside Mira, watching her tiny hand slip into mine as Threll Van settled into the chair across from us, his expression unreadable behind features that were not built to show human emotion in any way I recognized. "Mira," he said, his translated voice carrying none of Ash's earlier flatness, something closer to careful neutrality instead. "Do you understand why I am here?" She nodded, small and stiff. "I would like you to tell me, in your own words, what your life has been like these last months," he said. "You may say anything you wish. No one will be angry with your answer, whatever it is." I braced myself for silence, for the retreat into stillness that had defined her for so long after the crash. Instead, something in her seemed to settle, and she began to speak, slowly at first, then with growing steadiness. She talked about the tomato plant she had named Hope. She talked about the small routines Daniel and she had built together, the shared meals, the quiet evenings, the way he had taught her to read star charts even though she still struggled with some of the harder words. She talked, briefly and without much elaboration, about the crash itself, and how afraid she had been in the days after, and how that fear had slowly become something smaller, something she could carry instead of something that carried her. "He didn't have to help me," she said finally, looking not at Threll Van but down at her own hands. "Nobody made him. He just did. Every day. Even when I couldn't talk. Even when I was scared of everything." Threll Van was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then he made a small notation on the device in front of him, thanked her formally, and ended the interview without further questions. I did not know, walking out of that room, whether her words had helped our case or hurt it. I only knew that I had never been prouder of anyone in my entire life. On the 22nd day, the night before the hearing, Commander Dree called me to his office. Grace was already there, along with a formal summary of everything we had assembled: the visitor logs, the character testimonies from a dozen crew members, the precedent from Ethan Calder's case, and, quietly included at the end, a transcript of Mira's own words. "There is no guarantee," Dree said, sliding the summary across the desk toward me. "I want you to understand that clearly before tomorrow. Kael'thi hearings are not decided by sentiment. They are decided by law, applied with more precision than almost any human court could manage." "I understand," I said. "But," he added, and something in his tone shifted just slightly, "in 30 years of working alongside the Kael'thi, I have never seen a case built with this much care. Whatever happens tomorrow, you did not fail this station, and you did not fail that child. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat beside Mira's bed long after she had drifted off, watching the small rise and fall of her breathing, and I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The wreck, the silence, the slow, careful work of building trust with someone who had every reason in the world to never trust another person again. The hearing took place the next morning in the station's largest conference hall, converted for the occasion into something resembling a formal court. Ash presided, flanked by 2 junior envoys, with Threll Van seated separately as an observer with full speaking rights. Commander Dree sat beside me, along with Grace, who had insisted on being present in case any point of law needed immediate clarification. Mira sat quietly in the front row beside Emma, who had promised to stay with her the entire time. Ash opened the proceedings with a formal recitation of the original debt claim, the destruction of the transport ship, the ancestral right of the household of Threll Ka to compensation in the form of guardianship. It took nearly 20 minutes, delivered in the same flat, unhurried tone he had used the very first day, and by the time he finished, the weight of it sat heavy across the entire room. Then it was our turn. Grace presented the legal precedent first, walking the room through the Ethan Calder ruling with the same patient clarity she had used to teach me over the last 3 weeks. Commander Dree followed with a formal statement on my conduct and standing within the station community. Liam and several other crew members gave brief testimonies about what they had personally witnessed over the last 11 months. Then it was my turn to speak. I had prepared something, days earlier, a careful statement built around every legal point Grace and I had assembled. Standing there in front of Ash, in front of Threll Van, in front of Mira, I found that none of those prepared words felt like enough. So I set them aside and spoke plainly instead. I'm not going to pretend I understand your laws the way you do, I said. I probably never will, but I understand this. 11 months ago, I pulled a scared, silent little girl out of a wreck that killed everyone she loved. I didn't do it because of any law. I did it because it was the only thing I could do in that moment that felt right. Everything since then, every quiet evening, every meal, every night she couldn't sleep, I did because I wanted to, not because anyone made me. If your law says that counts for something, then I'm asking you to honor it. And if it doesn't, then I'm asking you to look at her and decide whether the law you're applying is really the kind of law your people want to be known for. The room was silent for a long moment after I finished. Ash studied me the same way he had that very first day in the mess hall, and beside him, Threll Van remained still, his expression as unreadable as ever. The Kelthie withdrew to deliberate, and the waiting that followed felt longer than the entire 3 weeks that had come before it. Mira sat pressed against my side, her small hand wrapped tightly around mine, and neither of us said a single word the entire time. When Ash returned, he did not waste time on ceremony. The precedent stands, he said. Continuity of care has been demonstrated beyond the required threshold. Character testimony has been weighed and accepted. The child's own account has been considered and found consistent with the record presented. He paused, and for the first time since I had met him, something in his flat voice shifted into what might, in a human, have been called respect. Guardianship is granted to Daniel Hargrove, effective immediately, and without further contest. The room erupted into a sound I had never heard on that station before, something between relief and disbelief, and pure, uncontained joy. Mira turned and buried her face against my shoulder, and for the first time since the night of the crash, I felt her whole body shake, not with fear this time, but with something lighter, something that had been waiting a very long time to finally let go. Threll Van rose from his seat without a word and left the hall, his objections apparently exhausted, his interest in the case concluded now that the precedent had been set against him. Ash lingered a moment longer than the others. Before he turned to leave, he looked at me once more and inclined his head, the same small gesture he had made 3 weeks earlier, though this time it carried a very different weight. You were right about one thing, human, he said. Law that forgets what it protects is not worth calling law at all. Then he was gone, and the conference hall slowly emptied around us, until it was only Mira and me left standing in the quiet, sunlight from the station's viewport falling warm across the floor. She looked up at me, and for the first time in 11 months, she smiled, a real smile, small and uncertain but entirely her own. "Does this mean you're really my guardian now?" she asked. "Not just for 23 days. "It means I'm your guardian for as long as you'll have me," I said. She thought about that for a moment, then nodded once, decisively, the way a much older person might close a deal they had been considering carefully. "Good," she said, "because Hope needs someone to help her water the tomato plant, and you always forget on Tuesdays." I laughed, the first real laugh I had allowed myself in 3 exhausting weeks, and together, we walked out of that hall and back toward the quiet, ordinary rhythm of a life that, against every expectation, had just quietly, permanently, become ours.